Okay, firstly, I'd like to thank everyone for what was an absolutely wonderful debate, and it's my absolute pleasure to close this off. On both sides of the house, the discussion has been incredibly civil, and is the constructive discourse that I hope that we actually move forward to in terms of our wider politics. Okay, so I think that one of the kind of basics of debating is that when you, as a proposition side, want to point out things that are wrong, you need to propose an alternative. And at the moment, it seems to me that at the very least, a large number of political parties in Scotland, and in particular the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, have mainly not actually proposed any alternatives to the Scottish government other than to stop the SNP and to stop IndyRef 2. And when, and I think that while this debate specifically has been very engaging with the policies of the government, where they are successful and where they fall, that is not necessarily applied to wider discourse, and from there it ends up being quite it ends up being a shouting match where both sides complain that the other one makes it all about independence, and we don't actually have a discussion about policies. Now, I think that when the SNP were re-elected to government in 2016, I don't think that they could really have envisaged that the government and that Brexit and would have ended up being the market things that you would have ended up taking. Molly, I'll take you.
Thanks very much. You mentioned that there are two sides. Do you believe there's only two sides in Scottish politics?
No, I don't believe that there's two sides in Scottish politics. I think that I do, however, think that that in particular, it seems that in the dominating discussion, you can end up just having end up having two sides, and that's bad. And I'm going to explain a little bit about that now. This was meant to come later in my speech, but because it actually directly responds to what you just said, I'll talk about it even more. So I think that when we're in a position of like minority governance, that can end up actually being quite good for the country, because you end up having relatively constructive discourse, because the government is in turn forced to negotiate with opposition parties in order to create budgets that they mutually that they mutually believe deliver for the country. Now, with the notable exception of the Liberal Democrats, we've seen with the notable exception of the Greens and the Liberal Democrats, we've notably seen an opposition that would, rather than negotiate with the government in good faith in order to implement their policies, we've just seen lines about the Constitution being rattled out here, there, and everywhere, and that doesn't actually produce anything healthy, because it reduces discussions about policy into just what constitutional side that you're on. Okay, so this back to kind of where I was going to start at. So, Brett, I think that when the UK voted to leave the EU, there was a notable refusal from the UK government and from political parties outside of the SNP generally to accept that Scotland as a voting bloc unanimously voted one way in direct opposition to how the wider vote went. Now, what that means, or what that should have meant, is that some form of constructive solution for Scotland in a way that would have been happy for both the Scottish government and the UK government should have been negotiated, so that could then be proposed to the European Union. However, the UK government has no interest in doing this, because they and remained intransigent when that happened. I think this also sort of applies to the drugs desk crisis. I'm not trying to pretend that the SNP and this government are completely in the right when it comes to the drugs desk crisis. However, there does definitely need to be some constructive discourse in terms of what are the Scottish government's responsibilities, what are the UK government's responsibilities, and where can they come together in order to create a definitive solution to what might end up being the biggest crisis of my generation and the biggest crisis of our times, outside of Brexit, outside of COVID. Now back onto COVID. I think that I'm not trying to pretend that the Scottish government got everything right. However, the Scottish government is a government that is relatively willing to put its hands up and say we did wrong. We're going to have an inquiry. We're going to investigate how we did wrong so that we can therefore make it right. And I think that therefore right. And we need to make sure that that process is engaged with so that we can then work out where did we go wrong? Where did we go right? How do we improve? And like, say, for example, stuff to do with public infrastructure. I don't necessarily think that Jamie is right when he says that the SNP have completely ignored north of Perth. If the SNP was completely ignoring north of Perth roads, considering he brought the A9, why would an SNP government, if they ignored north of the Central Belt, want to build the Aberdeen Western Peripheral route? If the SNP were ignoring the Central Belt, were ignoring north of Perth, why would they want to dual the A96? Yes, Andrew, I'll take you.
Thank you very much, Jack. I feel bad because Neil Findlay had a point of information in before, but I will take your kindness and go with it. On the AWPR was in the pipeline for a very long time. It was actually first proposed under the Labour and Liberal Democrat coalition government in Holyrood. And as for the dualling of the A96, it's now being delayed again. Our point is that if there are infrastructure projects in the Central Belt, they get to go ahead and seem to be built immediately, whilst in the northeast of Scotland, we have to wait year after year after year for funding to be spent up here.
I don't think that's necessarily true. In that like the concept of an Aberdeen, of like some form of bypass covering the city of Aberdeen, had been in the works for like 50 years or whatever, and it came through across the devolution era, and in spite of things like the collapse of Carillion, which is something that I don't think the Scottish government could have particularly envisaged, that's naturally going to cause delays. That's naturally going to cause budgetary issues. So like, I don't think it's necessarily true that the Scottish government ignores these things. And in particular, when it comes to the building of infrastructure, the Scottish government are still facing the consequences of PFI contracts that were signed by the previous Labour Liberal Democrat executive, and the move away from those PFI contracts is naturally going to make infrastructure projects more expensive in the short term. But it means that we're not actually paying out of our own pockets. No, you're back into protective time. Okay, so what have I told you today? I've talked about why there is a lack of alternative being proposed on side proposition. I've talked about why the Scottish government has the ability to like put its hands up and say that it got wrong. That is a good thing for discourse, and it is a good thing for wider society. And it also means that we can learn from our mistakes. And if we have a government that learns from our mistakes, that's going to be a government that acts in the interests of the people of Scotland, which I think the SNP have done, both since 2007 and since 2016. Thank you very much.